The year is 413 BCE. The sun sets over the Athenian Acropolis, its golden rays casting long shadows over a city weighed down by the burden of war. For over a decade, Athens and Sparta have been locked in a brutal struggle, a conflict that has bled Greece dry. But now, after the catastrophic failure of the Sicilian Expedition, Athens stands at the precipice of ruin. The empire that once ruled the Aegean is on the defensive, reeling from a defeat so devastating that few could have imagined it possible. The Sicilian expedition had been a disaster of unprecedented scale. The entire Athenian force, tens of thousands of soldiers, sailors and citizens, was annihilated. The survivors, those unfortunate enough not to fall in battle, languished in the hellish quarries of Syracuse, left to die of hunger and disease. News of the defeat reached Athens like a storm, crashing against the city's walls. A hush of disbelief fell upon the people, followed by a growing wave of panic. Their fleet, the backbone of Athenian power, had been shattered. Their treasury, already strained, could not sustain another full-scale war effort. Their allies, seeing weakness, began to waver, but Athens was not dead yet. Meanwhile, Sparta sensed its moment of triumph was near. The once mighty Athenian war machine was battered, its morale crushed. King Agis II, stationed at Decelea in northern Attica, had been waging a relentless war of attrition. Spartan forces raided the countryside year-round, cutting Athens off from its vital grain supplies. For the first time in its history, Athens faced starvation within its own walls. Yet Sparta did not act alone. An even greater force lurked in the shadows, one that would tip the scales definitively: Persia. Persia, ever the master of playing Greek against Greek, saw an opportunity to weaken its old enemy Athens. With the promise of gold, the Spartans found themselves with a new and powerful ally. The young Persian prince, Cyrus the Younger, with ambitions of his own, funneled vast sums into the Spartan war effort, allowing them to build a fleet capable of challenging the Athenians at sea, a domain Athens had dominated for decades. This was no longer just a war between Athens and Sparta. It had become a war where outside forces dictated the fate of Greece itself. Yet, in the face of overwhelming adversity, Athens did what it had always done best. It adapted. The Athenians rebuilt their fleet with remarkable speed, taxing their allies to the breaking point, draining every resource they had left. A brilliant but controversial figure, Alcibiades, once exiled as a traitor, emerged as an unlikely saviour, a man of cunning, ambition, and an unparalleled ability to manipulate events to his advantage. Alcibiades had walked the treacherous corridors of power in both Sparta and Persia before making a dramatic return to Athens. He promised victory, and the desperate Athenians, having little choice, embraced him once more. With his strategic mind at the helm, Athens was not ready to surrender, not yet. The stage was set for the final, bloodiest phase of the war. The battles that followed would be waged not only on land and sea, but also within the very heart of Athenian politics. The city would face betrayal, tyranny, and moments of fleeting hope, only to be met with crushing despair. The Spartan navy, once inferior, would soon prove to be a formidable force under the command of the ruthless and brilliant Lysander. And when the final battle came, it would not be fought in the streets of Athens, but on the waters where the fate of an empire would be decided. For the Greek world, the war was no longer just a clash of two superpowers. It had become an existential struggle for survival. Who would stand? Who would fall? And what kind of Greece would emerge from the ashes of this war? The answer was coming, and it would change the course of history forever. The defeat of the Athenian expedition in Sicily was not merely a setback, it was an unmitigated disaster, the likes of which Athens had never before experienced. The campaign, which had begun with grand ambitions of conquest, had ended in absolute ruin. The once mighty Athenian force, consisting of thousands of hoplites, sailors, and elite commanders, was now either dead, enslaved, or left to perish in foreign lands. The catastrophe reached its climax in the final battle at the great harbour of Syracuse. The Athenians, trapped and desperate, had hoped for one last opportunity to break out, but the Syracusans, with their superior local knowledge and reinforced fleet, anticipated their every move. As the battle raged on, the once proud Athenian navy, which had dominated the seas for decades, was methodically crushed, rammed, and shattered. The harbour itself became a graveyard of ships, some burning, others splintered to pieces, their wreckage floating aimlessly, a grim testament to the folly of Athenian ambition. When the realization of defeat set in, chaos consumed the Athenian ranks. The surviving soldiers and sailors, many of whom had never known such overwhelming disaster, abandoned their positions and fled inland. Thousands of them wandered the Sicilian countryside, weak from exhaustion, starving, and without hope of rescue. Their only fate was either death at the hands of Syracusan cavalry or capture, which would lead to an equally grim destiny. Among those captured were two of Athens's highest-ranking commanders, Nicias and Demosthenes. Demosthenes, a bold strategist known for his aggressive tactics, had fought to the bitter end, but was ultimately forced to surrender. Nicias, on the other hand, had been reluctant about the expedition from the beginning. He had argued against it in Athens, warning of the risks, and yet, through a cruel twist of fate, found himself leading the doomed campaign. Now both men stood before their captors, stripped of their command, their legacy forever tied to this debacle. Initially, there were those among the Syracusans who saw value in sparing Nicias. Even the Spartan general Gylippus, who had masterminded the defence of Syracuse, favoured taking Nicias alive, perhaps as a bargaining chip, or as a means of humiliating Athens further. But the Syracusans, fueled by their hatred of Athenian imperialism and eager to exact revenge, would hear none of it. Both Nicias and Demosthenes were executed, their bodies discarded as a warning to any who might dare invade Sicilian soil again. Yet their fate, though tragic, paled in comparison to what awaited the thousands of Athenian prisoners. The survivors of the expedition were herded into the stone quarries of Syracuse, vast open pits where they were left exposed to the brutal sun by day and the freezing cold by night. With little food, no shelter, and no hope of escape, they perished slowly, some from starvation, others from disease, all suffering in the most wretched of conditions. Those who did survive were eventually sold into slavery, scattered across the Greek world as the remnants of a once mighty force that had dared to challenge Sicily. Back in Athens, the impact of the news was earth-shattering. The city had gambled everything on the Sicilian campaign, its best men, its strongest ships, its wealth, and its future ambitions. Now, all of it was gone. The staggering loss of life and resources was unparalleled in Athenian history. The once proud democracy, known for its confidence and defiance, was left in stunned silence. When the ships carrying the survivors, those few who had managed to escape, finally limped back to Athens, they brought with them not just tales of defeat, but an overwhelming sense of doom. The psychological impact of the disaster was profound. The people of Athens, who had once believed in the inevitability of their empire's triumph, were now gripped by fear and despair. Many wondered if the gods themselves had abandoned them. Some blamed the reckless ambition of their leaders, others pointed to the hubris of the assembly that had approved the expedition despite warnings. What was clear to all, however, was that Athens was no longer the invincible power it had once been. But worse was yet to come. Their enemies, particularly Sparta and its allies, saw the weakness in Athens and moved swiftly to take advantage of it. The war, which had already dragged on for nearly 2 decades, was far from over, but for Athens, the tides had permanently shifted against them. As the news of Athens' catastrophic defeat in Sicily reached the Greek world, it sent ripples of shock through both allies and enemies alike. The great imperial city, once thought invincible, had suffered a humiliation so severe that its enemies saw a rare and irresistible opportunity. Among those who recognized the moment for decisive action was King Agis II of Sparta. A shrewd strategist and a man of relentless resolve, Agis understood that the time had come to strike at the very heart of the Athenian Empire, not by sea, where Athens still held dominance, but by land, where its vulnerability had long been apparent. For years, the Peloponnesians had launched annual invasions into Attica, burning fields, seizing livestock, and ravaging the countryside. But these campaigns had always been temporary. The Spartans, wary of prolonged commitments outside their homeland, would withdraw at the onset of winter, allowing the Athenians to rebuild and recover. Now, however, Agis proposed something far more devastating, a permanent Spartan occupation on Athenian soil. His chosen location was Decelea, a strategic stronghold just 14 miles north of Athens, perched on the foothills of Mount Parnes. This was no ordinary outpost. It was a dagger aimed directly at the throat of the Athenian economy. The decision to establish a year-round Spartan base at Decelea in 413 BCE was a masterstroke of strategy. It accomplished what annual invasions had failed to do: cripple Athenian agriculture, disrupt internal supply lines, and demoralize the city from within. The Athenians, trapped behind their long walls, could no longer rely on their rural estates for sustenance. The rich farmlands of Attica, which had always been the source of Athens' strength, were now firmly in the grip of the Spartans. But the consequences of Decelea's occupation extended beyond mere military pressure. The city of Athens depended heavily on a vast network of silver mines at Laurium, which supplied the crucial wealth needed to sustain its fleet and empire. With the Spartans controlling access to the region, these mines were effectively lost. The flow of silver, once a lifeline for the Athenian war effort, was choked off, forcing the government to rely on heavy taxation and emergency measures that only deepened the strain on its people. What made this even more disastrous was the mass defection of Athenian slaves, many of them skilled labourers from the silver mines, who fled in droves to the Spartan camp at Decelea. Thousands of slaves, desperate for freedom from the back-breaking toil of Athens' war economy, abandoned their masters and sought refuge with the Peloponnesians. This exodus not only weakened Athenian industry, but also emboldened internal divisions within the city, where tensions between rich and poor were already simmering beneath the surface. Decelea, then, was more than just a military outpost. It was a psychological siege, a constant reminder to the Athenians that their enemies were no longer mere invaders, but conquerors who had carved out a permanent foothold in their very homeland. It forced Athens to rely even more heavily on its maritime empire, stretching its resources thin just as it was reeling from the losses in Sicily. The city's ability to project power abroad was now dependent on its fragile control over the Aegean and its dwindling economic reserves. Meanwhile, Agis II relished his new role as commander of Decelea. Unlike most Spartan kings who traditionally remained in Sparta unless leading major campaigns, Agis chose to stay in Attica year-round, overseeing operations, directing raids, and ensuring that Athens remained under relentless pressure. His presence was a constant threat, a symbol that Sparta would no longer fight Athens on temporary terms. The occupation of Decelea marked a turning point in the war, one that Thucydides himself describes as a decisive factor in Athens' decline. The city, once confident in its ability to withstand Spartan attacks, was now under siege from within. Food shortages became a reality, economic distress mounted, and the psychological strain of seeing enemy forces stationed so close to their walls began to take its toll on the Athenian populace. From the moment the Spartans fortified Decelea, the balance of power in the Peloponnesian War had shifted. Athens, once the unchallenged ruler of the Aegean, was now a city under siege, not by naval blockades or distant campaigns, but by the presence of its most formidable enemy standing at its very doorstep. As the crushing news of the Sicilian disaster reached Athens, the weight of reality settled over the city like a suffocating shroud. For decades, the Athenian Empire had thrived on its ability to sustain war through its vast financial resources and powerful naval dominance. Now that foundation was crumbling. The defeat in Sicily had not only drained Athens of its finest soldiers and ships, but had also left the city in a dire economic position. The treasury, once filled with tribute from allied states, was rapidly depleting. The silver mines of Laurium, a critical source of income, were now inaccessible due to the Spartan occupation of Decelea. And with Attica's fertile lands under enemy control, the city's food supply was in jeopardy. The Spartans' fortification of Decelea proved to be more than just a military maneuver. It was an economic stranglehold. By establishing a year-round presence just outside Athens, they cut off vital overland trade routes and disrupted the agrarian economy that had sustained the city for generations. Farms were abandoned, livestock was seized or slaughtered, and rural populations fled behind the long walls, further burdening an already struggling urban infrastructure. Where once the countryside had provided sustenance and stability, it now lay in ruin, controlled by an enemy that had no intention of leaving. Athens, now largely cut off from its own territory, was forced to rely entirely on imported grain from the Black Sea region, modern-day Ukraine. But this trade was precarious. The lifeline of food shipments from the Hellespont and the Aegean could be disrupted at any moment by hostile naval forces. The cost of securing these shipments soared, leading to economic strain that the already exhausted population could barely endure. The once proud empire, built on the wealth of its navy and its trade routes, now found itself struggling just to feed its people. But even as Athens grappled with internal collapse, an even greater threat loomed beyond the Aegean. Persia had entered the war. For years, the Persian Empire had watched the Greek conflict from a distance, preferring to see the two great powers, Athens and Sparta, wear each other down. Now, sensing a decisive moment, Tissaphernes, the Persian satrap of Lydia, reached out to Sparta with an offer that would tip the balance of the war. In exchange for Persian financial backing, Sparta would recognize Persian control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor, a region Athens had long held under its influence. This agreement was a betrayal of the very cause Sparta claimed to champion. For years, Sparta had justified its war against Athens as a struggle to free the Greeks from Athenian imperial rule. Now, in pursuit of victory, the Spartans willingly handed over those very same Greeks to Persian rule. It was an uneasy alliance, bound not by shared ideals but by mutual opportunism. Sparta needed Persian gold to build and maintain a fleet that could finally challenge Athenian naval dominance, and Persia sought to reassert its authority in the region after nearly a century of Greek interference. At first, the Persian support came in limited waves. Tissaphernes, ever the cunning politician, played both sides, offering funds to Sparta while deliberately holding back full-scale financial support, ensuring that neither side could gain a swift victory. His strategy was clear: let the Greeks exhaust themselves, and when the moment was right, Persia would reclaim its lost territories with ease. For Athens, the implications were devastating. Sparta, a city that had long prided itself on its land-based military strength, now had the means to construct a fleet that could challenge the Athenian navy. The war was no longer confined to mainland Greece. It had become a global conflict, with the wealth of Persia fueling the Spartan war machine. With Decelea strangling Athens' resources from the land and Persia bankrolling its greatest enemy, the walls of Athens, both literally and figuratively, were beginning to close in. The city's leaders knew that the road ahead would be one of desperation and survival. The question was no longer whether Athens could win the war, but whether it could endure the relentless siege that was now tightening around it. The war that had begun as a clash between Greek city-states was no longer a simple contest of hoplites and ships. It had become something far more complex, far more dangerous. By 412 BCE, Athens, once the unchallenged master of the Aegean, stood battered and bleeding. The defeat in Sicily had shattered its confidence. The Spartan occupation of Decelea had drained its resources, and the unthinkable was now becoming clear. The tide of war was turning against them, but Sparta, for all its recent successes, faced its own limitations. The Spartans had never been a naval power. Their strength lay in the phalanx, in the discipline of their warriors, in the raw force of their hoplites on the battlefield. The sea was a realm they had never truly mastered, a battleground where Athens still held the advantage. If Sparta was to finish this war, if it was to bring Athens to its knees once and for all, it needed ships, it needed money, and there was only one place to get it. Somewhere along the Ionian coast, under the watchful eye of the great king's envoys, a meeting unlike any other in Greek history was taking place. A Spartan delegation, led by envoys of the Peloponnesian League, arrived in Sardis, the glittering Persian capital of Asia Minor. There, waiting for them in the lavish halls of his satrapal palace, stood Tissaphernes, the satrap of Lydia, a man who had watched from the sidelines as the Greek world tore itself apart. Tissaphernes was no ordinary governor. He was calculating, ruthless, and patient. He had waited years for this moment, carefully observing the war, understanding its rhythm and knowing exactly when to strike. And now, at long last, the Spartans had come to him, not as conquerors, not as warriors, but as beggars in search of Persian gold. The Spartans, proud as they were, hated this moment. For generations they had fashioned themselves as the defenders of Greek freedom, the great adversaries of Persia, the very force that had repelled the empire's armies in the Persian wars. And yet here they were, standing before a Persian satrap, offering what they had once sworn never to surrender, Greek land in exchange for Persian coin. Tissaphernes listened. He knew what they wanted, he knew what he could offer, but he was not going to make it easy. "Gold is not given freely," he told them. "What will Sparta give in return?" The Spartans, through gritted teeth, answered they would cede the Greek cities of Ionia, once proud members of the Delian League, now pawns in a greater game. Athens had ruled them for decades, and now Sparta was offering them back to their old masters in exchange for the funds needed to build a navy that could finally challenge the Athenian fleet. It was a betrayal of everything Sparta claimed to stand for. But war has no room for honor, only for victory and defeat. The agreement was signed. Persia would finance the construction of a Spartan fleet, supplying the Peloponnesian League with the means to break Athens' dominance of the seas. But there was a catch. Tissaphernes was no fool. He would not hand over gold too quickly. Persia would keep the Spartans on a leash, feeding them just enough support to keep them fighting, but never enough to win outright. The great king, Darius II, had no desire to see a powerful Sparta rise in Athens' place. He wanted both cities weakened, drained, exhausted, so that when the time came, Persia could reclaim its lost dominion over the Aegean without resistance. Gold began to flow, but in carefully measured amounts. Spartan ships took to the waters of Ionia, manned by crews funded by Persian silver. Athenian strongholds, once secure, now trembled as Sparta's newly emboldened fleet took to the waves. But while the Spartans prepared for war, the Athenians were beginning to realize the depth of their peril. The news of the Spartan-Persian alliance reached Athens like a storm rolling over the horizon. Until now, even in their darkest moments, the Athenians had always held the sea. The city might starve, its fields might burn, but so long as its navy controlled the Aegean, Athens could not fall. Now that certainty was crumbling. For the first time, Athens was facing not just Sparta, but an empire of limitless wealth and resources. Persia's involvement meant that Athens could no longer rely on its financial advantage, nor could it assume that its fleet was unmatched. If Sparta could sustain a naval war indefinitely, then what hope remained? Desperation gripped the city. The assembly met in frantic sessions, debating what could be done. Emergency taxes were imposed. The wealthy were forced to fund new triremes at their own expense. Every coin, every resource was poured into the defense of the fleet. But the tide had shifted. This was no longer the same war that had begun so many years ago. It had evolved into something far larger, a war where the fate of Greece was now entangled with the ambitions of a foreign empire. Persia was no longer just a distant power beyond the Aegean. It was here, in the heart of the war, shaping its outcome from the shadows. Athens, once so certain of its supremacy, now found itself in a battle it was no longer sure it could win. The moment the Persian gold began flowing into Spartan hands, the war changed forever. No longer was Athens facing a land-based enemy it could keep at bay with its fleet. Now, for the first time in the war, Sparta had a navy, one funded by Persian silver, manned by Peloponnesian sailors, and led by commanders determined to break Athenian control of the Aegean. The stage for this new chapter of the war was Ionia, the eastern coastline of the Greek world, where Athenian influence had long been unchallenged. The cities of Ionia, Ephesus, Miletus, Chios, had once been Persian subjects, but after the Greco-Persian Wars they had become part of Athens' vast maritime empire, paying tribute to the city in return for protection. Now, with Spartan warships arriving in their harbours and Persian satraps whispering promises of freedom, these cities stood at the centre of a struggle that would decide the fate of the war. It started in Chios. Chios, one of the most powerful and wealthiest members of the Athenian alliance, had long been watched by Sparta as a potential weak point. Now, with Persian backing, the Spartans convinced the Chians to revolt. A fleet of Peloponnesian ships, funded by Persia and carrying Spartan commanders, sailed to Chios, where they were welcomed as liberators. The Athenian garrison stationed on the island was caught off guard. Within days, Chios was lost. From there, the rebellion spread like wildfire. Miletus, a major city on the Ionian coast, joined the revolt, its leaders eager to cast off Athenian rule. Other cities followed, emboldened by the sight of Spartan triremes patrolling their harbours and Persian officials promising them autonomy in exchange for loyalty. Athens, stunned by the sudden turn of events, reacted swiftly. A fleet was dispatched from Athens, and reinforcements were summoned from Samos, the last remaining major Athenian stronghold in the region. The battles that followed were the first true naval clashes between Athens and a Spartan fleet, a force that just years before would have been considered a laughable concept. With Chios and Miletus slipping from its grasp, Athens had only one major outpost left in Ionia, Samos. Samos had always been one of the most loyal members of the Athenian Empire, and now it became the heart of Athenian resistance in the eastern Aegean. The island's harbour became a staging ground where the remaining Athenian fleets regrouped and prepared for counterattacks. But Samos was not just a military outpost. It became something far more significant. It became a refuge for democracy itself. Back in Athens, the city was in turmoil. Political divisions were deepening, and the war had taken a heavy toll on the morale of the people. But in Samos, among the Athenian sailors and officers stationed there, a new kind of unity emerged. The men in Samos saw themselves not just as warriors, but as the last true defenders of Athens' democratic ideals. And among them was a man who had once been exiled, a man whose name was still spoken with a mix of hatred and admiration in Athens, a man who was about to make his return to history. Alcibiades. Brilliant, charismatic, unpredictable, and a traitor. At least that was what Athens had called him. Years earlier, Alcibiades had been the rising star of Athenian politics, a daring commander who had convinced the people to launch the Sicilian Expedition. But when things went wrong, when Athens turned against him, he had fled to Sparta, where he had given them the very advice that had led to the fortification of Decelea, one of the most devastating blows against his own city. But then, in typical Alcibiades fashion, he had betrayed Sparta as well, fleeing to Persia and offering his services to the satrap Tissaphernes. There, Alcibiades played both sides, whispering to the Persians that they should keep both Athens and Sparta weak, ensuring that neither would emerge victorious. Now, in 412 BCE, Alcibiades saw yet another opportunity to return to the Athenian side, but on his own terms. The Athenian fleet at Samos needed a leader. Athens itself was in chaos, but the men in Samos still had hope. They had heard of Alcibiades' dealings with the Persians, his knowledge of both Spartan and Persian strategy. They knew that if anyone could help them turn the tide in Ionia, it was him. Alcibiades, always a master of persuasion, convinced them. He promised that through his connections with Tissaphernes, he could cut off Persian aid to Sparta. He spoke of leading Athens to one last resurgence, of reclaiming lost territories, of restoring the empire's glory. And just like that, the man once branded a traitor became a commander of the Athenian navy. With Alcibiades advising them, the Athenians launched counterattacks against the rebellious Ionian cities. The battles were fierce. In the waters near Miletus, Athenian triremes clashed with the newly built Spartan fleet, marking the first true test of Persian-funded naval warfare. The Spartans, inexperienced at sea, relied on their Corinthian allies and Persian support, but the Athenians, even in their weakened state, were still the masters of the Aegean. The battles were chaotic and brutal. At times, the Athenians found themselves outnumbered, their supplies running low, their strength stretched thin, but their experience, their speed, and their desperation to survive drove them forward. By the end of 412 BCE, neither side had landed a decisive blow. Athens had held on to Samos, had retaken some lost ground, and had stalled Sparta's momentum. But Sparta, fueled by Persian gold, was not retreating. The war had now evolved into something neither side had expected, a prolonged, grinding struggle for control over Ionia, fought city by city, ship by ship. Athens had regained a champion in Alcibiades, but at what cost? Would his ambition truly save them, or was he merely using them for his own rise back to power? Sparta had gained a fleet, but could it truly challenge Athenian dominance of the seas? And Persia, watching from the sidelines, feeding both sides just enough to keep the war going, how long would it play this game before deciding to claim all of Greece for itself? The war had entered its final and deadliest phase, and the outcome was still far from decided. The city was restless, The streets, once filled with the clamour of merchants and philosophers, now held an uneasy silence. Athens had endured war, famine, and siege, but what was coming now was different. This was not the enemy at the gates, this was the enemy within. It started with whispers, quiet at first, just rumours drifting through the agora. Words of powerful men meeting in secret, of a plan to save Athens from itself. Then came the disappearances. Figures who had once spoken for the people were suddenly gone. Some fled the city, others were not so lucky. And then one morning it was done. The assembly, the heart of Athenian democracy, the place where citizens had ruled themselves for generations, was no more. Armed men filled the pinnaces, standing between the people and their voices. A new government had declared itself in power, the 400, a council of the wealthy, the elite, the men who had long despised the rule of the common people. They called it a necessity. They called it salvation. They promised stability, an end to the war, a treaty with Sparta. But the people knew the truth. This was not salvation. This was a coup. The city fell into a stunned silence. The guards in the streets carried their weapons not against an invading army, but against their own citizens. No more votes, no more debates, only orders, only silence. And then the killings began. Anyone who opposed the new government vanished. Some were dragged from their homes in the dead of night. Some were cut down in broad daylight, a warning to anyone else who might dare to speak. The people of Athens, who had once held the world's first great democracy in their hands, now walked their own streets in fear. The city had fallen, or so it seemed. Far from Athens, across the sea, another part of the city still lived, the fleet at Samos. It was there, among the sailors and soldiers, that the true spirit of Athens still burned. When the news arrived, when word spread that their home had fallen into the hands of traitors, the reaction was not fear, it was fury. These were men who had fought for Athens, who had bled for it. They had sailed into battle again and again, defending their empire, their city, their people. And now they were being told that it was gone, that the assembly had been erased, that the war was lost because a handful of aristocrats had decided it should be. No, Athens did not belong to kings. It did not belong to tyrants. It belonged to them. And so, aboard their ships in the harbours of Samos, they made a choice. They would not recognize the 400. They would not accept the coup. They would fight. And at their side stood a man who had been called a traitor, a man who had once betrayed Athens, then betrayed Sparta, then whispered in the ears of Persian satraps and played all sides of the war like a master gambler. Alcibiades. The fleet turned to him. He promised them that Athens could still be saved, that democracy could still be restored, that if they stood together they could take back what was theirs. The navy, the last true force of the Athenian Empire, was no longer just an arm of the city. Now they were the city. Back in Athens, the rule of the 400 was already crumbling. They had promised order, but the city grew more restless by the day. They had promised peace, but Sparta had given them nothing. Their support cracked. Even among their own ranks, men began to waver. Some of them, once so sure of their grip on power, now saw the writing on the walls. And then came the moment they could not ignore. The fleet had declared its defiance. The navy, the power that had once made Athens ruler of the Aegean, had turned against them. And the people? They were watching. The streets, once silent in fear, began to shift. Murmurs turned to shouts. Shouts turned to action. The people of Athens, beaten down but not broken, rose up. The oligarchs tried to hold on. They tried to send their enforcers to crush the rebellion before it could grow. But it was too late. Some of the 400 were hunted down and killed. Others fled into the night, slipping into exile before the mob could reach them. And the assembly, the voice of the people, was restored. Athens, wounded and weary, had fought back, but this was no victory parade. There were no cheers, no celebrations. Too much had been lost, too much had been broken. The war was still raging, the enemy was still closing in. And though democracy had returned, Athens was not the same city it had been before. The final battle was coming, and this time there would be no second chances. Here, the words of Thucydides come to an end. His account of the war, the rise and fall, the betrayals, the shifting tides of power, ends in the year 411 BCE, with Athens still standing, still fighting, still clawing its way through the darkness. But history does not stop. The war raged on, and now it is Xenophon, an Athenian soldier and historian, who picks up the story. His account, the Hellenica, tells of the final years of the Peloponnesian War, of the desperate gambits, the last victories, the crushing defeats, and of the moment when Athens, the empire of the sea, finally fell. Despite the chaos in Athens, the coup, the revolt at Samos, the near collapse of democracy, the war was not over. The Athenian fleet, battered but unbeaten, still controlled the Aegean. And if Athens was to survive, that fleet had to fight. Sparta, with Persian gold filling its war chest, was no longer just a land power. It had a navy now. Ships built with Persian silver, manned by experienced Corinthian and Spartan sailors, were hunting down Athenian forces across the sea. One by one, Athens' allies in Ionia wavered. Some defected, some fell. But Athens would not surrender, not yet. In the summer of 411 BCE, the Athenian fleet, commanded by Thrasybulus and Thrasyllus, sailed to confront the Spartan forces in the Hellespont, the vital waterway that connected the Aegean to the Black Sea, the lifeline of Athens' grain supply. If the Spartans cut this route, Athens would starve. The two navies met off the coast of Cynossema, a narrow stretch of water where speed and maneuverability mattered more than brute force. The Spartan fleet, led by Mindarus, was larger, stronger, and better funded. By all logic, this should have been the battle that crushed the Athenians once and for all. Instead, it became a moment of defiance. The Athenian fleet was outnumbered. Their ships were damaged, their crews exhausted from years of endless war. But they had one thing the Spartans did not: experience. The battle began as expected. The Spartans surged forward, confident in their superior numbers. The Athenians fell back, seemingly in retreat, but it was a trap. Thrasybulus, at the head of his fleet, suddenly wheeled his ships around, catching the Spartans off guard. The narrow waters of the Hellespont became a death trap. Athens' faster, more agile triremes darted between the clumsy Spartan vessels, ramming and sinking them one by one. For the first time since the Sicilian disaster, Athens had won a major battle. The Spartans, who had been so close to total victory, had been humiliated at sea. Mindarus, their commander, was forced to retreat to Abydos, sending a desperate message to his allies. "Ships lost, Mindarus dead, the men are starving, we know not what to do." But one victory was not enough. Athens had won at Cynossema, but the sea was still teeming with enemies. The fleet that had secured that desperate triumph was still too small, too fragile to reclaim its lost empire. And across the waters, Sparta was watching, learning, adapting. They would not be caught off guard again. Over the next year, the war tightened its grip on the Aegean. The Ionian coast became a battlefield of shifting tides, where neither side could afford to falter, where the fight for every island, every harbour, every inlet became a matter of survival. At Abydos, the Athenians struck first. They came with speed and fury, their triremes slicing through the waves like daggers. The Spartans, caught between land and sea, were forced back but not broken. They clung to their stronghold, regrouping, readying themselves for the next strike. In Lesbos, the Spartans made their move. They sought to carve a new path to sever Athens' grip on the northern Aegean, but the Athenians, desperate, relentless, denied them at every turn. Every maneuver was countered, every push met resistance. And in the waters off Miletus and Ephesus, the two fleets hunted each other in the dark. There were no grand victories, no final blows, only clashes in the night, ships passing like shadows, strikes of ramming prows in the moonlight, the cries of dying men lost to the wind. Both navies were growing stronger, gathering allies, repairing their broken hulls, training new crews to replace the fallen. But only one side had time on its side. The difference between Athens and Sparta now was not skill, not courage, but endurance. Sparta had Persian gold. Every ship lost could be replaced. Every setback was a delay, not a disaster. Athens had only itself. Every trireme that sank was a wound that would not heal. Every defeat was not a pause. It was a step closer to the abyss. And the men of Athens knew it. They fought like men who had nothing left to lose, because in truth they didn't. They had seen what happened when their enemies triumphed. They had watched Melos burn, had heard the stories of Mytilene's slaughter, had seen their allies crushed one by one. They knew what awaited them if Athens lost the sea. The navy was their last defence, their last hope, the last thing standing between them and destruction. And in the great halls of the city, in the whispered conversations of weary politicians, a question was beginning to take shape, not how to win, but whether winning was even possible anymore. The war was dragging toward its final act, and the next battle would bring Athens one step closer to the end. The city had seen his face before, on statues, on paintings, on the lips of men who cursed his name and others who whispered it like a prayer, but not like this. Now, after years of exile, betrayal, and shifting allegiances, Alcibiades had returned to Athens, and the city held its breath. It had been 6 years since he had fled, since the people who once adored him had turned against him. They had hailed him as a hero, the bright, young, brilliant commander who would lead Athens to greatness, and then they had condemned him as a traitor. The Sicilian Expedition had been his idea, his vision of conquest, his grand design. But before the fleet had even reached its destination, he had been recalled to stand trial, accused of defiling the sacred Hermes, a charge he swore was false. He had fled instead, fled to Sparta, of all places, and there, in the halls of Athens' greatest enemy, he had given away her secrets, advising the Spartans to fortify Decelea, a move that had crippled his own city. But Sparta too had turned against him, and so he had fled again, this time to Persia, to the satrap Tissaphernes, where he had whispered in Persian ears, shifting alliances like a gambler rolling dice. Now, through sheer cunning, through manoeuvring that defied logic and loyalty, he had found himself at the head of the Athenian fleet in Samos, not as a prisoner, not as an exile, but as a leader once more, and now he was coming home. The triremes arrived first, sweeping into the Piraeus harbour, their sails catching the golden light of the evening sun. Then came the cheers, hesitant at first, then rising in a wave. He had been the city's greatest traitor, and now he was its only hope. The people lined the streets as Alcibiades stepped onto Athenian soil, flanked by soldiers who had fought beside him, men who had followed him across the Aegean, who had seen him bring victory where there should have been none. They had heard the stories, how, under his command, the fleet had reversed Athens' fortunes, how he had struck at the Spartan navy again and again, pushing them back, keeping Athens afloat when all seemed lost. They had no choice but to forgive him, for now. Under Alcibiades, the Athenian fleet was reborn. At Notium, at Chios, at Byzantium, he led the navy in a series of lightning-fast assaults, seizing territory Athens had thought lost forever. He disrupted Spartan supply lines, forcing them onto the defensive. He rallied the allies of Athens, convincing them that the war was not yet over, that victory was still possible. And for the first time in years, Athens had hope. The people, once so quick to turn on him, now celebrated his name. They saw in him the same brilliance, the same daring, the same reckless genius that had once captured their imagination. For a brief fleeting moment it seemed as if Athens might rise again. But not everyone was cheering. In the back rooms of Athens, in the halls of the government, whispers had begun to spread. In the assembly, among the politicians and generals, there were men who remembered. They remembered how easily he had switched sides, how quickly he had abandoned the city when it suited him, how he had betrayed them once before. Would he do it again? Alcibiades knew this city as well as anyone. He knew its love was fickle, its loyalty conditional. And then, in 407 BCE, came the moment he had dreaded. A single mistake, a single defeat. The Battle of Notium. A skirmish he did not even command personally. One of his lieutenants had led the Athenians into a Spartan ambush, and they had paid the price in blood and wreckage. And just like that, the doubts turned to accusations. The same voices that had cheered him in the streets now muttered against him in the assembly. Had he lost his touch? Was he playing another game? Had he once again betrayed them? He saw the signs. He knew what was coming. This was Athens. It never forgave forever. So before they could exile him, before they could turn on him again, he left. Vanished. Where? No one knew. He had disappeared into the north, into Thrace, to a private estate, far from the city that had once worshipped him and then cast him aside. The man who had dreamed of ruling Athens, who had once held its fate in his hands, was now an outcast once more. And Athens, still locked in the grip of war, was now marching toward its final, fateful battle. The sea was rough that morning, the winds howling through the sails of the Athenian fleet. The sky was dark, the air thick with salt and tension. The Spartans were waiting. It was the year 406 BCE, and Athens was running out of time. For decades they had fought for control of the sea, for dominance over the Aegean. Now they were hanging by a thread. The navy, once the pride of the empire, was battered, its ships aging, its ranks filled with inexperienced rowers and desperate recruits. And then came the news. The Spartan fleet under Callicratidas had taken Lesbos, cutting off Athens from one of its most vital outposts. If the Spartans held their ground, the Athenian fleet would starve, and the war would be over. Athens had one last chance to strike back. With every remaining ship they could muster, some newly built, others barely seaworthy, they sailed to the Arginusae Islands, off the coast of Asia Minor. The battle that followed would be one of the greatest Athenian victories of the war. And yet it would also become one of the darkest moments in Athens' history. The Spartans were waiting for them, 120 warships, experienced crews, hardened warriors. And for the first time in the war, Athens had the advantage in numbers, 150 triremes, many of them newly constructed, their crews hastily trained. But it was enough. The battle erupted in a storm of wood and bronze, the crashing of ships, the screams of men thrown into the sea. The Athenians, desperate, fought like they had never fought before. They outmaneuvered the Spartans, striking from both flanks, forcing them into chaos. They pressed the attack relentlessly, cutting through enemy lines. They destroyed over 70 Spartan ships, a devastating loss for their enemy. Callicratidas, the Spartan admiral, went down with his ship, refusing to abandon his men. His fleet was broken, scattered, the survivors retreating in disarray. Against all odds, Athens had won. It should have been a moment of triumph. But the sea had other plans. The wreckage of war drifted across the water. Spartan ships burned in the distance, their crews drowning, dying. But among them, in the waves, were Athenian sailors too, men from the victorious fleet, men whose ships had been shattered in the battle. They were still alive. They were waiting to be rescued. But the storm came too fast. Black clouds rolled across the sky, the winds howling, the waves rising like walls of water. The Athenian commanders, 10 of them, the leaders of the fleet, faced an impossible decision. They had two choices. They could chase down the remaining Spartan ships, ensuring that the enemy fleet would never rise again, securing Athens' control of the sea, or they could try to rescue their drowning men. The storm made it impossible to do both. In the chaos, the decision was made. They would pursue the enemy. They had won the battle. The war was still raging. The men in the water, they would have to fend for themselves. By the time the storm cleared, it was too late. Hundreds of Athenian sailors were gone, lost to the sea, abandoned by their own commanders. And back in Athens, the people were waiting for an explanation. When the fleet returned to Athens, they expected to be celebrated. They had crushed the Spartan navy after all. They had bought their city more time, more hope. Instead, they were met with rage. The families of the dead demanded justice. The assembly, always unpredictable, was hungry for blame. How could they have abandoned their own men? It didn't matter that the storm had made the rescue impossible. It didn't matter that Athens needed the victory more than it needed those few hundred men. All that mattered was that they had been left to die. And so, in a decision that shocked even the harshest critics of Athenian politics, the assembly put its own generals on trial. 6 of the 10 commanders, men who had led Athens to one of its greatest victories, stood before the people. They pleaded their case, explaining the impossible choice they had faced, the storm, the urgency of war. It didn't matter. The city wanted blood. In a mockery of justice, in a trial fueled by grief and fury, all 6 were condemned to death. And just like that, Athens had taken its best commanders, its last hope for victory, and killed them. The war did not stop. Sparta was still out there. The fleet had survived, but now it was leaderless, directionless. The men who could have saved Athens had been executed by their own city. And in the shadows, in the places where whispers travelled faster than the wind, one thought began to spread. Athens had won a battle, but it had already lost the war. The war had raged for 26 years. Cities had burned, fleets had been shattered, thousands had died in battles across the Aegean. Now it was all coming to an end. The last great fleet of Athens was on the water. Their ships, barely replaced after the slaughter at Arginusi, still held together by the remnants of the once mighty empire. The fate of Athens, the fate of its people, the fate of everything it had built, rested in the hands of these sailors. And across the sea, Sparta was waiting. The man who stood at the head of the Spartan fleet was not like the others before him. His name was Lysander, brilliant, patient, ruthless. Unlike his predecessors, he did not seek glory in battle. He did not look for fair fights. He looked for victory. And now, as he watched the Athenians from his position at Lampsacus across the narrow waters of the Hellespont, he saw his chance. The Athenians had camped at Aegospotami, a barren, exposed stretch of coastline where they had no proper harbour, no walls, no defence. Every morning they sailed out into the strait, challenging Lysander to battle, and every morning he refused to fight. Day after day the Athenians rowed out, shouting, daring him to face them, and every day he ignored them. It was a game of patience. Lysander watched them grow comfortable, careless. He knew that Athens was desperate, that their commanders were under pressure to strike, to find victory before their city collapsed. And then, on the 5th day, the Athenians made their mistake. That morning, just as before, the Athenian ships sailed out, but the Spartans did not engage, and so, as they had done every day before, the Athenians returned to shore, scattered, relaxed, convinced that the Spartans would not fight. Some left their ships to wander inland in search of food. Others rested on the beaches, weapons left too far from their reach. And then Lysander struck. Without warning, the Spartan fleet exploded forward, racing across the water in a sudden, coordinated assault. The Athenians had no time to react. Their fleet was still on the shore. Men scrambled toward their ships, but it was too late. The Spartans rammed them where they lay. The beach turned to chaos, men running, screaming, trying to flee as the enemy poured in from the sea. Ships were burned. Captains were dragged from their decks. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. Out of the 180 Athenian triremes, only a handful escaped. The rest were either destroyed or captured. Thousands of Athenian sailors were taken prisoner. Thousands more lay dead on the shore, their weapons never even drawn. And just like that, Athens had lost its navy. The Athenian fleet had been its last defence. The sea was its lifeline, the one thing that had kept the city alive during all these years of war. Now, with their navy destroyed, the Spartans moved in for the kill. Lysander sailed south, capturing every remaining Athenian stronghold in the Aegean. He cut off their supply lines, severed their trade routes, took away their food. Athens, isolated and alone, began to starve. In the city, panic set in. The grain ships from the Black Sea, gone. The last hope of holding on to their empire, gone. The men who had been expected to return in triumph, dead or enslaved. The war was over. And now Sparta was coming for Athens itself. The city was starving. Once Athens had ruled the Aegean, its ships stretching from Ionia to the Peloponnesus, its wealth flowing in from every port in the empire. Now those ports were silent. The long walls that had protected the city for decades, that had shielded it from Spartan invasion, now trapped it in its own slow death. There was no food, no ships, no hope. For months, Athens had held on, its people wasting away behind their walls, praying for a miracle that would never come. The fields outside had been burned. The grain ships from the Black Sea were never returning. The once great navy, the pride of Athens, had been shattered at Aegospotami. And the Spartans? They waited. Lysander, the architect of Athens' downfall, had no need to attack. He simply let time do the killing. And now, as winter fell upon the city, in 404 BCE, the Athenians, the same people who had once refused to kneel before the Persian king, the same people who had defied Sparta for a generation, finally broke. The envoys left the city, gaunt, hollow-eyed, defeated. They travelled to Sparta, the enemy they had once laughed at, the enemy they had spent decades mocking, calling them simple, uneducated, backwards. Now those same Spartans held their fate in their hands. The terms were clear. The Athenian Empire was no more. Every city that had once paid tribute to Athens was now free, free to choose its own path, free to turn against its former master. The fleet, what little remained of it, was to be destroyed. Athens would be allowed only 12 ships, a number too small to be a threat, a number meant to humiliate them. The long walls, those mighty walls that had once made Athens untouchable, were to be torn down. For decades, those walls had been the city's shield, its lifeline, the connection between Athens and the sea. Now they would crumble, stone by stone, under Spartan command. And when the envoys returned, when the terms were read aloud to the people of Athens, there was no fight left in them, no speeches, no desperate last stand, only silence. And then agreement. The war was over. The Spartans entered Athens not as conquerors, not as looters, but as victors enforcing their will. The first order was given: bring down the walls. With axes, hammers, bare hands, the work began. Brick by brick, the mighty walls that had once symbolized Athens' strength were pulled apart, their collapse echoing like a funeral bell. And as the Spartans worked, their flutes played the sound of celebration, of victory, of finality. Athens, the city that had once stood defiant against Persia, the city that had built an empire from the ashes of war, was no longer a power. It was just another city. But Sparta was not done. They had not come just to tear down walls. They had come to remake the city in their own image. A new government was installed. 30 men, handpicked by Sparta, were given absolute power. They were called the 30 Tyrants, and their rule would be unlike anything Athens had ever known. The assembly was abolished. The people, who had once shaped the destiny of the city through debate and vote, had no voice anymore. Executions began immediately. The 30 ruled with terror, hunting down their political enemies, exiling or killing anyone who had spoken against Sparta. Informants lurked in every corner. Old rivals settled scores in the dead of night. Blood ran through the streets, the city suffocating under its own fear. Athens had once stood for freedom. Now it drowned in tyranny. There was one last blow. Among the new rulers, among those who now served Spartan interests, stood Critias, once a student of Socrates, once an Athenian statesman. Now he led the 30 with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that democracy, the very idea of Athens itself, was erased. The city had once been filled with voices, debating, arguing, questioning. Now it was silent. And in that silence, Athens, the Athens that had defied the world, that had built an empire, that had shaped history itself, was gone. Only the ruins remained, and the memory of what had been.